Slave trade had reached its peak in the 1770s and 1780s and was seeing increased calls for its abolition thanks to Enlightenment principles such as those we looked at with Mary Wollstonecraft. The idea of a universal human nature was becoming increasingly difficult to deny to other groups of people. So just to give a brief sense of the timeline of this, in 1772, there was a famous court ruling, which was basically that a slave could not be forced to return to the West Indies from England. Although it was a kind of specific kind of ruling, it was taken very much to mean that anybody in England was technically free, that if you brought a slave to England, they would immediately therefore become free because they could not be forced to return to being a slave in the colonies. So this led to the rather paradoxical situation in which slavery was still perfectly legal in the British colonies, but not legal in England itself. As I've mentioned, the 1770s and 1780s saw increased calls for abolition. The Society for Abolition was mentioned in the Wilberforce speech to Parliament. But Wilberforce's abolition bill was rejected in 1791. So we can see at this point there is a great deal of agitation for abolition of slavery, that a lot of people were against the idea of slavery, but at the same time the country as a whole was not ready to renounce it. So Parliament defeated that bill. It's worth noting in 1804, the Republic of Haiti, after a lengthy slave uprising, finally declared independence from France. So here we have an example of an island in the West Indies essentially taking freedom into its own hands and rebelling against the imperial masters. In 1807, Britain abolishes the slave trade, so it's illegal now to actually traffic in slaves, to send ships to Africa to buy slaves, but importantly, slavery is still legal in the West Indies, so you couldn't go and buy or sell new slaves, but the institution of slavery was still very much intact. It's not until 1833 where the Slavery Abolition Act finally does abolish slavery in the British Empire. And that's not followed until 1865 in America. And it takes, obviously, a civil war in America to reach that point. Just looking at some of the texts I asked you to look at for this week, Kwabena Ottaba Cugoano's Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and the Commerce of the Human Species, published in 1787, Cugoano is one of an increasing number of former slaves who spoke out against slavery. It was the first to write a treatise against it. A number of other former slaves had written their stories as a form of anti-slavery narrative. Olaudio Equiano is a particularly famous example of that. In Cugoano's argument, he advances a moral argument against the materialistic concerns of slave owners, and argues that they should morally let their slaves go. But he also makes the very practical point that these plantations would still be profitable if they were worked by free laborers. So he's making a moral point, and he's arguing that a country run on these moral principles and the ideal of liberty, he says, will necessarily prosper. while he warns of dangers associated with the continued use of slaves. The most notable danger there, of course, would be the danger of an uprising. But it's notable that he has to mix the language of moral right with the language of economics. That it's that there's something practical about freeing the slaves, not just that it's the morally right thing to do. Similarly, in Wilberforce's speech, as I mentioned, Wilberforce was probably the foremost abolitionist of his time, but his abolition bill was defeated in Parliament. In the speech in your textbook, he refers to a report that has demonstrated the harmful effects of slavery to Africa in particular. He says, as if that really needed to be shown, but the benefit of it, he says, is that England can no longer claim ignorance of this. We now know exactly how harmful it is to Africa. And again, Wilberforce makes economic arguments to complement his moral arguments. The idea that traffic in slaves will ultimately destroy economic relations between England and Africa, given the violence involved and the potentially damaging of that relationship. Would be economically bad, not just morally wrong. So the point I'm making here is just noting the way in which abolitionists, even as much as they are motivated by moral principles to oppose slavery, we still see how they have to speak this language of economics to try to convince the audience that they're aiming at. And it's maybe appropriate to comment on Barbauld's epistle to William Wilberforce in this context as well. She writes this poem immediately after the defeat of Wilberforce's abolition bill. And interestingly, in rhetorical terms, she starts by urging him to give up. Cease, Wilberforce, to urge thy generous aim. Thy country knows the sin and stands the shame. So the effect of urging him to give up, even though she agrees with him, is striking, and she kind of proves Wilberforce's point that England now knows all of the evils of slavery, but England, she knows and she persists. Still Afric bleeds unchecked, the human traffic still proceeds. The country has seen the truth, but still won't give up the practice of slavery. So Barbauld is kind of echoing Wilberforce and saying that the shame is all the greater because now England knows everything. And despite the fact that there are many voices combined to support this argument, where seasoned tools of avarice prevail, a nation's eloquence combined must fail. Each flimsy sophistry by turns they try, the plausive argument, the daring lie. These deceptive rhetorical strategies are simply used to evade the truth. Notice how Barbauld characterizes the point of view of the proponents of slavery as mere rhetoric, whereas the good anti-slavery side is described in terms of eloquence, i.e., effective rhetorical strategies. The poem ends with a prediction that Wilberforce will be remembered with honor and the country's decision with shame. Succeeding times your struggles and their fate with mingled shame and triumph shall relate, while faithful history in her various page, marking the features of this motley age, to shed a glory and to fix a stain, tells how you strove, and that you strove in vain. In other words, that Wilberforce history will record Wilberforce's efforts, but also, and more to the point for Barbauld, that those efforts turned out to be fruitless. So we can see very much how the rhetorical force of this poem comes from this sense of bitter resignation to the failure of this cause. Wilberforce is so clearly right, and yet he's being ignored. Barbauld emphasizes the injustice of that point.